Hello everyone and welcome. If you're new to this channel, my name is Émilie and my partner Emily and I are planning a trek to Mount Kilimanjaro in a couple months.
So what exactly is high altitude? Well, the exact values are going to vary a bit depending on where you're getting your information from, but high altitude is roughly 8,000 to 12,000 feet. After that, you're looking at very high altitude, which is 12,000 to 18,000 feet, and extremely high altitude is anything above 18,000 feet. Now, when you're at sea level, oxygen makes up about 21% of the air around you. The amount of oxygen in the air doesn't actually change. What does change is the air density. So just imagine those oxygen molecules moving further and further away from each other, and it being harder for you to get as much oxygen in one breath the higher up you are.
Now let's talk about how the altitude might affect you. So most people are okay to go up to about 2,500 meters without any effects. If you've already been to high altitudes and you're coming back, you're most likely going to be okay. If you were okay the first time, if you had symptoms the first time, however, you might get them again. But altitude is a little bit of a funny thing, because there are no specific factors like age, gender, or physical condition that will lead one person to be more affected by altitude or one person to be less affected by altitude. What it all boils down to is you just need to go to high altitude locations and see how your body reacts. In a safe way, of course. So without getting into too much scientific detail, there are three main types of mountain or altitude sickness. The first one, which is AMS, is what most people will encounter while going up Mount Kilimanjaro if they encounter any kind of altitude sickness at all. So AMS stands for acute mountain sickness. Most people will start experiencing symptoms of AMS at about 3,000 meters above sea level. Let's go into a little storytelling here. The first time that I summited Mount Kilimanjaro, I remember it specifically on day 3 or day 4, we had reached about 4,000 meters. And not less than 20 minutes after that, I started feeling a little nauseous, I started having a headache, and 10 minutes later I was vomiting on the side of the trail. I didn't obviously experience any symptoms that put me in danger. I was just being watched a little bit more by our guides, and our guides also knew that we would be sleeping lower than that point that night. So I would be able to acclimatize myself for this higher elevation, sleep at a lower level, and then the next day when we got back up to that point, I was most likely going to be okay. So I was just suffering some of the milder symptoms that typically come with AMS. I do remember obviously having nausea and having a lack of appetite, but I still had to keep hydrated because that is also one of the most important things that you can do to make sure that you don't have any severe symptoms. But the next day, as we had slept lower than 4,000 meters, my body had acclimatized and I was perfectly fine to resume the rest of our trek. Some symptoms are a lot more severe and will end up with having someone being airlifted or immediately have to go back down to lower levels of altitude.
And this is why acclimatization is so important. Now, acclimatization is the name that's given to the process of the body getting used to taking in lower amounts of oxygen per breath and just dealing with its everyday functions at a higher altitude where the air density is lower. The only way to do this is to actually be at the altitude and spend some time there. Now, some routes of treks are recognised as being better than others for allowing for a good acclimatization. On Kilimanjaro in particular, routes like the Lemosho or the alternative Lemosho route are recognised to be great for this. It's also really recommended that you climb high, sleep low. That means that your body is getting a chance to get used to the higher altitudes, but you're sleeping a little bit lower so that your body still has a chance to rest and really acclimatise. Now, on treks like Kilimanjaro, the human body is actually able to adapt to these new altitudes. There is, however, a cut-off of this. It's generally recognised that from about 26,000 feet and above, the human body is no longer able to adapt to these new altitudes, and it's what's known as the death zone. It's called the death zone because it's not actually able to sustain human life any longer, and mountaineers who are doing climbs like Everest will find themselves in the death zone and have a limited amount of time that they can spend at those high altitudes. But Emily and I will not be dealing with those types of heights in our trek to Kilimanjaro. We're going to be climbing the Uhuru peak of Kilimanjaro, which is just under 6,000 feet. And there's no maximum amount of time that we are allowed to spend there, but generally people spend around 15 to 45 minutes at the top before starting their descent. And that's just because if you haven't acclimatized properly, the longer you spend there, the higher your chances are of getting some of the symptoms of altitude sickness. And we don't want that.
Now let's quickly talk about the difference between hiking, trekking, and mountaineering, because those three definitions have a lot to do with altitude as well. So hiking can be described as just your typical day hike. 2 to 8 hours, you don't stay overnight anywhere, well-marked trails, and then trekking, which is kind of level 2, is a hike but with a little bit more difficulty and overnight trips. You have a backpack and you carry all your sleeping material and your food with you, and you go for 2 to 3 nights at a time. And then mountaineering, which is kind of level 3, is like trekking, except it takes you to higher altitudes, so altitudes above 5,000 meters. And then mountaineering also most often than not requires you to have special equipment or special training. I can safely say that Mount Kilimanjaro is probably somewhere between trekking and mountaineering. It's more so like mountaineering because Mount Kilimanjaro is at 5,895 meters, so above 5,000 meters of altitude. But Mount Kilimanjaro doesn't require you to have any prior special experience using equipment. It's just like a very long trek.
Thank you guys for watching. We hope that you learned something new about acclimatization and climbing at high altitudes. Some of these facts can seem a little bit scary, but something that I learned is that it's so much better to go in, educate yourself, and be over-prepared, because it all comes down to just keeping yourself safe when you're doing your trekking or mountaineering, maybe even hiking. And do subscribe if you want to see more updates about our preparation for our trek to Kilimanjaro. Thanks for watching, guys.